afternoon. My name is Kendra Mailing.
And I'm Kristen Fowler.
And today we're going to be presenting on our Scholars for Syria GAP project. So to get started, we'd like to provide you some background about why this issue is important to us. So talking about what is the Syrian crisis. So long term, it's this conflict between the government and groups that are rebelling against the government. The government is right now controlled by the Assad family, and they've held power since 1971. It's important to note that they're not religiously extreme, so there's some misconceptions about why the crisis is, how it started, and why it's continuing. Basically, the rebel groups are angry because of the failure of some promised economic and political reforms. So all of the conflicts began in the spring of 2011. Some young protesters were jailed, they were tortured, some were even killed in detention centers, which really led to more public riots. So as you see, in April 2011, the Syrian army started firing on demonstrators, and so these protests became full-scale, really violent form of rebellion. Later on, in the summer of that same year, the Free Syrian Army was formed, and now there's three groups that are fighting for power, fighting against each other. There's mass atrocities. We've seen the horrible effects of chemical warfare being used throughout the crisis, and as a result of all of this coming together, there's a refugee crisis, which we'll go into some detail about later on in the presentation. To paint a more accurate picture of what the Syrian crisis is, we have two informational clips that we'd like to show you. This first one is from National Geographic and talks about the refugee crisis. Has really started to kindle among us and just here in America, and it really represents the fight for life that these people are going through. We have one other video that we'd like to use to portray why we chose our issue, and this video talks about how children specifically are affected. That's important to us because our project targeted American children.
شفت انه بتصير ضرب والعالم هيك بتموت وشي عالم محترقة هاي العمي مات شهيد من الحرب ومن الضرب. صرنا أنا صرت ناديله يا أبي. كان في أخواتي وأنا والبابا والماما هم بسوريا. بخاف يموتوا لا سمح الله. أنا شفت صاروخ قام ينزل، قلت هيك بوم تستبرد بوم بوم زدنا عزيز هيك الغابة أخذنا لمطرح بعيد. ستة طياد يقع عليهم البيت. أحلى شجر بحياتي يعني شفته العصافير والطيور والهيدي بس بيتي. يعني الأرض شوفت صوت الجوع من حد الطعمية، الشجر يبيس من حد شامل. يعني أنا أول شي هيك مثل الحلم، يعني أنا لعبت يعني شفتها هيك مثل الحلم. يعني شيء يجي عليهم الطياد يزوق عليهم. شيء تغصفهم بالرصاص. أنا مش شايفة عبير سنة. أرجع على بلدي وعلى المدرسة على رفاقي. حاسة لا بس وقت أنا هيك تأثرت علي كتير. حبوني وأنا بحبهم كتير.
Okay, so Kristen's going to talk a little bit about why we chose this project.
So I hope that you guys had maybe like this strong urge to do something after watching those videos, and we certainly did. So that was a big reason why this project was kind of started for us. Obviously our connection to Scholars for Syria, so we're both Scholars for Syria officers, and from that club came this desire to make a product, make a gap presentation where we could give a deliverable service to the greater Evansville community, not only impacting UE students, but also the larger community here in Evansville. So a lot of the inspiration for this project in and of itself came from the large percentage of Syrian students that we have here at the university. We are actually the university with the third highest percentage of Syrian students in the United States. That's rather incredible considering the small size of our university, that we represent such a large group of Syrians here. We recognize that there's this general apathy towards the problems that are going on in Syria, the crisis, not wanting to understand, maybe not caring enough to understand. So really just trying to educate people in the country in general about what's going on there and why we should care. Because we do have a lot of compassion towards these Syrians that are both still in Syria, that are in the US, and that are concerned about what's going on in their home country, or that are other places in the world. No matter where they are, they're all concerned, they're all in danger. And then we find that the most effective way to synthesize learning is to really create a dialogue where people can interact with each other and better understand what's going on in the world and what they can do and what they can understand from each other. So we involved the Syrian students here with the high school students that we went to see and the community in general so that we could further educate everybody through this dialogue. So a little more about how we went about creating that dialogue. We designed a project to educate high school students by taking our Syrian students into their classrooms. And so we connected with the Syrian students at UE to help them kind of develop their personal story into such a small presentation that was able to be disseminated to these high school students, really highlighting the impacts that this crisis has had on them, as well as whatever the high school teacher wanted them to cover, be it the crisis, be it their religion or culture, but also making sure that their story, their personal story, really got embedded in there somehow. We wanted to make sure that we facilitated these presentations with our Syrian student volunteers and the coordinating teachers in EVSC so that these projects came together successfully, and then at the actual presentations we collected data both before and after the presentation by the Syrian student to gauge if the high school students' attitudes and feelings towards Syrians and their plight had changed.
So looking at a breakdown of what our service looks like, it really begins with that initial scheduling with the local high schools. And we were blessed to work with a partner through Scholars for Syria, Kent Houston, who has a lot of what we call WASTA. So he has a lot of great connections in the local area and was able to help us schedule and plan those presentations. So then the second step of our service is sending out a pre-survey developed prior to all the presentations, sent out via email to the high school teachers. And then those teachers were responsible for making sure that each of their students who we were going to be presenting to took their survey. Then we actually traveled to the high school, so this involved a lot of coordination. We had a lot of volunteers who contributed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then comes the actual presentation. So what that looks like, we don't have the link yet, but we'll be showing you some clips from the presentations and our volunteers speaking. But the presentation starts with the Syrian story, so that usually lasts about half an hour. And then we follow with a question and answer session, which really allows for some more intimate conversation about what the Syrian experience looked like and why high schoolers in America should care. Following the presentation and the Q&A session, we conduct the post-survey, which is identical to the pre-survey, so that we can hold all of those different variables constant and measure the impact of our programming. Then we see the creative element of our project, which was a whiteboard campaign that we developed around the hashtag #StandWithSyria. The reason that we chose this project is because it is used through social media, and that is a platform that high schoolers are really familiar with, and it allows us to connect with them on a level that maybe we wouldn't otherwise be able to reach out to them on. So what they do is we give them a blank piece of paper and challenge them to use this hashtag to make a statement about why they care about Syria or why people that they know should care. So we'll show you a clip about what that project has resulted in later. And then the very last step of our service is after we're not in the schools any longer, it's probably been a few days, we follow up via email with an optional reflection prompt. We send that to the high school teacher. It has 3 questions on it, which allows for some free response, either in the form of prose or poetry. And we did an examination of what those responses were as well, so you'll see that in our results. Looking at who was involved in our project, we have 3 main players outside of Kristen and I's personal time. So we talked a lot about Scholars for Syria, so we want to thank Gail Vignola because she is our GAP class instructor as well as our advisor for Scholars for Syria, and so much of what we do would not have been possible without her guidance and encouragement. We've talked about Kent Houston. He's also an advisor for Scholars for Syria and was really critical in getting into the schools. He knows a lot about the legality of filming in classrooms and how we can get in there. Megan King is the SGA rep for Scholars for Syria. She helped with the facilitating of these presentations by filling in for those presentations that Kristen and I couldn't always be at. Then Deb Shady and Judy Quanti were avid supporters of our project throughout the whole time. They even helped provide transportation to several of the presentations. The second bullet says Syrian students at the University of Evansville, and this is the heart and soul of our project, and truthfully, without them, we can't do this, because people ask us a lot of times, like, why do you guys care about Syria? Like, you're white women in America, so how much can you know? The truth is that we wouldn't know a lot of what we do know without having that important dialogue with these men here, but also women have been involved. So we'd like to thank Hashem, Ahmad, Walid, and Safi for their continual commitment to our project and the time that they gave to us. Lastly, we want to mention ACES Media Group, specifically Jacob Loops. They provided a lot of resources to us in terms of filming our presentations and putting together our social media outreach. Who did our project impact? This one's kind of obvious. Really, it's the high school students. So Bossy High School, Boonville, Castle, Mount Vernon, and Memorial High School are the locations where we presented. And then talking about why high school students is really important to our project as well. So when we're trying to choose a target demographic, we chose high schoolers because they're eager to learn. They're already in a classroom setting, which allows us to disseminate that important knowledge in a really great environment. High school students are new voters, or are going to be voters in the near future because of their age. And so it's important to give them, truth and knowledge to provide them with the tools to make informed opinions. And then lastly, we see that they're easily influenced by social media, which is not to say college students and adults are not, but again, going back to that's a platform that they're really familiar with, and so a lot of times misinformation is passed around on social media, so we wanted to provide that quality information to them. So we're going to start talking about some of the results from those pre and post surveys, and we'll give some background with the demographics. So on the left, you'll see the distribution of students by their academic year. And so you can see here that we really reached a lot of seniors based on just the type of classes that we went into that were only available to seniors to take. So the rest of the grades are pretty equally distributed. Looking at gender, it's pretty equal again. with a few more females being reached out to, and then a few students chose not to respond to that question. Looking at ethnicity, this is really important to the meaning of the data that we'll discuss later. So predominantly, over 75% were white students that we worked with the next greatest number of students being African American, followed by other. And then we also had Asian and Hispanic students represented. Looking at their religious affiliation also provided us with some interesting, with an interesting perspective to look at our data. So again, almost 3/4 of the students we reached out to reported that they were Christian, followed by not religious with the light blue here. And then we have other is the next largest representation. We also had students who were Jewish, Muslim, and Hindu. One of the first questions that we asked students on the survey is, what do you think American citizens' view of Syria is? So a lot of the graphics that you'll see today are very compelling. So I encourage you to look at the difference between the before, which is the blue bars, and the after, which is red. So before, we see the majority of students were on the very favorable side of the spectrum, meaning that they thought Americans viewed Syria in a favorable light. However, after the presentation, you see more students showing up on this end of the spectrum. So this shows that our presentations really did get through to them and even changed some of their opinions. They realized that Americans don't really have as favorable of a view of Syria as they previously thought. Some of the questions on our survey were free response, and these provided us with some great insight as to what high schoolers are thinking. So we asked them, what comes to your mind when you hear the word Syria? So we've developed a graphic, and the words that are larger indicate that these responses were more frequently reported. The words that are smaller, we chose to put on there so they weren't reported as often, but are still provide that unique insight. So the biggest words we see are refugees, ISIS, crisis, death, bombs, terrorism, and immigrants. Some of the smaller words, hot, Arabic, hope, Muslim, undeveloped, oil prices, poverty, lack of freedom, once peaceful. And so Kristen and I are going to share some of the responses verbatim of what the students said, just to paint that picture for you more accurately. So before the presentation, this is what they said.
Syrian refugees, the Syrian war taking place, many Syrian civilians being harmed, innocent people being killed, America's responsibility to help. I feel like Syria's unique culture has been shadowed by ISIS and the civil warfare that has plagued the country for many years. I really don't know too much about Syria except for the fact that it's not a great place right now. I think of a predominantly Islamic foreign nation that is currently troubled by ISIS. Foreign land, a lot of people with clothes that cover their faces and bodies. Civil war, Middle East, culture, Russia, USA, Kurdish, unstable fighting. A war-torn country that could really benefit if ISIS would stop fighting everyone. Also, after ISIS is gone, could be a beautiful country. And perhaps most concerning of all, not my problem.
So some of those responses are gut-wrenching like that last one, but when we looked at what they responded with after the presentations, we had more of an encouraging outlook. So here's what students said. Peaceful people. We shouldn't categorize people into groups based off of religion, but people are quick to think of ISIS. Another student said, a country full of refugees and a corrupt government, all well threatened by the terrorist group ISIS. Used to be one of the most peaceful countries, but now is one of the most dangerous. Destruction and war that is not supported by the majority of people. Corruption and senseless fighting. Previously, my answer was ISIS. A bad situation that is partially America's fault. Not so different from the rest of us. Another student said, now when I hear Syria, I think of a country that is divided. Not all citizens partake in the fighting or the warfare. There are aspects of Syrian culture that are heartwarming, like emphasis on family time. Refugees needing to get to the States and away from the war. And the last student said, I now think misinterpreted. So we really see a change holistically when we're looking at it. We got a lot more positive responses and sympathetic responses from the high school students. However, we still do have a few students whose opinions weren't changed, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is later. So this next graphic is much simpler than some of our previous ones. We simply asked them, did you know there was a war going on in Syria currently? So it is encouraging that before the presentation, over 80% of students did know about the war, which we didn't really expect that, so that's nice to know. But then when we look at the after, we have almost a 15% increase. So that's encouraging that our message is reaching out to the students. And here we still see that a couple students reported that they didn't know there was a war going on in Syria, which just speaks to the fact that you can't change everyone, you can't make everyone be engaged in what you're saying all the time. So to tie into that question, after we ask them, do you know there's a war, we ask them what they know about the war. So this is really interesting as well. We developed a similar graphic, and so again, the bigger words indicate a more frequent response. So we have ISIS, dying, rebels overthrowing government, ISIS versus rebels versus government, global superpower involvement, uninformed. So this is a combination of what they said before and after. And so we're going to give you some of those verbatim responses again.
So before the presentation, students said things like, it is a civil war between ISIS and the rebel fighters. ISIS has taken over, causing citizens to flee. Bashar al-Assad is a dictator who is being opposed by a rebel group within Syria. Al-Assad is backed by Russia and the USA is backing the rebels. Ceasefire agreements have failed and Russia is possibly attacking rebels, not ISIS. The Kurds also have a part in it. I don't know anything about the war. Involves ISIS, many Syrians involved with ISIS. War is unfortunate, but not underlined USA's problem. I know that there are multiple groups fighting for control of the oil wells and land in Syria. The largest and most threatening group is ISIS. Many countries have vowed to fight against its bases in Syria. Innocent children are bombed or forced out of their country into refugee camps. It is mutually considered an international crisis/emergency. Islamic radical terrorists have invaded the country in order to bring its land and people under the control of ISIS. There are fundamental differences in the practice of Islam, and a large divide splits the two sides because of this. So as you can see from these before answers, there were a lot of misinformed ideas in these high school students' minds. So a lot of them think that this war started because of ISIS, when in actuality it was a dispute between the government and the civilian rebels. And so you see ISIS being thrown out a lot as the cause of this, which is not the case. But then you also just saw a large majority of students who said, I don't really know much. I don't know anything. I just know that there's war, but I don't know what's actually going on. Fortunately, as you could tell, we did have a few students who had a pretty decent background knowledge of it before we even came into present, but unfortunately these were the minority.
So looking at what the students said after the presentations. The war is similar to our revolution. Another student said, a political radical group called ISIS is attacking nearby people in order to expand its territory. It's a political war with the word religion used to justify acts. I knew before the presentation that there were a lot of people killed, but now I know why, and it hurts me to know that it's because of what they believe. People are getting killed for the smallest things, like even speaking their opinion. Last, a student said, 3 groups are all fighting for power, while global superpowers sit back and watch it happen. So we see that there's some more understanding of the depth of the issue based on their responses from that. So that's really encouraging towards the effect of our project.
So next we asked students, what was your emotional response to the war? So both before and after our presentation, you see that their most common answer was sad, which I really encourage you to think back to those videos that we showed you earlier and perhaps understand why that was their immediate response. I think that that's something that a lot of us can relate to, and I think that that's a natural emotional response for these students to have. Yet you see it almost double, in fact over double, by the time that these students had actually heard what was really going on. They had heard from a real-life Syrian who was there standing in front of them telling their story. You see that all of the emotions that we would hope would rise. So things like disgusted, you see that rise. Again, that's a natural emotional response. Most encouragingly, we see indifferent and confused lower significantly. So that means that confused, one, we made a difference, we showed them some sort of information and they felt like they had a better grasp on it. And also indifferent was one that was really important for us to change. a lot of these students before the presentation, based on their answers, were rather removed from the situation. They didn't think it was their problem, as you saw before, or they just didn't see how it connected to them on any level, so they just removed themselves from it. But we see this sort of trend lower dramatically after the presentation. So next we told them that Syrians are largely not currently allowed to enter the United States at this time, and we asked if they agreed with the government's decision on this. As you can see, this is really a quite compelling graph, so I would really encourage you to take a look at it and really pay attention to the bars. So before our presentation, you see most of them are hovering around 3 and 4 as the majority, meaning that they're either in the middle, they don't really know what to think, or they agree with the fact that Syrians should not be allowed to enter. Yet you see a very different distribution on our after bars. So you see strongly disagree with the government's decision being the most prevalent answer, and then a lovely stair-step decline after that to where a small minority of them still strongly agreed, but it was the smallest minority of all. So then we asked students, why do you feel this way about their entry? This was another way that we wanted to not only assess the quantitative, so do you think they should be allowed, but the why behind it with a more qualitative answer. So here we kind of tried to sum up for you some underlying themes in these students' responses. So we have, most encouragingly, that they fully supported Syrian students, most prevalently before, but also almost doubling after the presentation. It's very encouraging to see this stand up so much higher than all of the other underlying themes that we picked out from their free responses. And then you see everything else is rather encouraging as well. So those students who theoretically supported Syrians coming to the US but weren't willing to risk it, thought it was too risky. This declined after, presumably to go more towards full support, as did allowing them to enter but with some restrictions. Again, presumably moving to full support. Then you see that the unsure or uninformed, that decreases dramatically. So we see that these students are now more understanding of the war and can form their own opinion, and this basically suggests that we did synthesize some learning. You also see that no support of Syrian entry, they did not want any Syrians to enter the United States. This decreased as well. Yet you see dismissive of social responsibility, devoid of concern, and fear remaining about the same, suggesting that these are perhaps more deeply ingrained, kind of innate emotional responses that are not going to be easily changed within a 30 to 45 minute span. However, it is encouraging to recognize that these were the minority. Next, we would like to show you a little bit of what they actually said. So we chose to pick out some underlying themes because we saw these recurring trends within their responses, but we want to give you some of their actual responses because they made an impact on us, and we think they'll make an impact on you as well. So before the presentation, when we asked why do you feel this way about their entry, they said, other countries have openly stated regret to letting Syrian refugees in, cause of trouble and possible terrorism. Because we do not know who these people are trying to enter our country. While it is terrible, we are not responsible. I do not believe that there is any way to successfully filter genuine good people from terrorists. The lives of my family and friends mean more to me than those of Syrians. They're people who are trying to escape a country where civilians are being killed and as a result of this war. Fear is preventing America from doing what is right. I think it is our duty as a superpower to give aid to people in need. I feel in order to make terrorism as low risk as possible, we need to not accept any refugees. They could be terrorists themselves, or even if they aren't, their presence will start something. Because one bad apple doesn't spoil the whole batch. Many of these Syrians need a strong, safe place to live after the war trauma they've been through. However, there is no good way to sort out the real terrorists from the needy refugees. Terrorists in the US could bring it down and cause it to fall with Syria. So they don't come bomb us all.
After the presentation, we asked the same question, and here's what students said about why they responded with what they responded. Syria is very dangerous, and we devalue human life when we don't give them a chance to leave the prison that they are living in. I believe we are a country built on immigrants and different religions. We have the resources, and we should help. Syrians are people just like us, still human, and need rights as well to feel safe. We don't know what they've gone through to get here or what they have seen. I understand the fear many have about ISIS sneaking in, but it is not fair for those searching for life. We can't screen all of them. 99% is good, but we have to protect our own first against people intending to do harm. We have enough immigrants. And lastly, I think they should be able to get out, but it's not the USA's job, so I understand the government's point of view.
So these really encapsulate this graph that you're seeing here of these underlying themes, and it really just goes back to the idea that these students' opinions were changed before and after the presentation. Next, we gave students 4 statements, not questions, and asked them to respond on a Likert scale of either strongly disagree to strongly agree, 1 to 5. On what they felt personally about these statements. So the first one was, I feel uneasy about Syrians. Again, this is a really compelling graphic that we are very encouraged by. So as you can see, most students were in the 2, 3, and 4 zone beforehand, so they weren't really strongly to one side or the other, but the most popular answer was 4, which means that they agreed that they felt somewhat uneasy about Syrians. However, after having a Syrian stand before them and tell their story, and maybe they realized that they're just like us, you see again that lovely stair-step decline where most students strongly disagreed that they felt uneasy about Syrians, and then a small minority of them still strongly agreed that they felt uneasy about Syrians, but this is certainly shadowed by the fact that most strongly disagreed with the statement. Next, we asked students if their family felt uneasy about Syrians. We thought that this was an important difference to highlight because we wanted to really see if these high school students were still basing their opinions off of maybe what they had been taught in their family beforehand, or if they were forming their own opinions. So we only give you the before answer on this one because presumably it would stay constant as their families were not viewing the presentation, only they were. As you can see here, most of them answered 3 or 4, meaning that they were either in the middle, they weren't really sure what their families felt, or they felt that their families did agree that they felt uneasy about Syrians. Next, we compared these 2 statements. So, I feel uneasy about Syrians, and my family feels uneasy about Syrians. We used the before answers for both of them because, as we mentioned previously, it would be unfair to compare a student's after to their families before when the family had not seen the presentation as well. And here you can see some pretty interesting results. So while they're kind of scattered all about, what you will notice is that in the 4 and 5, which is strongly agree that they feel uneasy about Syrians, the family bars are higher than the students' bars, even before the presentation. So this in and of itself suggests that these students are forming their own ideas and opinions and are not directly taking maybe like what their parents say verbatim. Next, we asked students if they would welcome Syrian refugees into the United States. This is encouraging in and of itself because most students agreed even beforehand that they would allow Syrian refugees into